After the relatively laissez-faire 1920s, a time of flappers, suffragettes, speakeasies, booming business, and prosperity for the once poor, the Depression of the 1930s was a crisis that shook the world's faith in free markets and shook the world's faith in the ability of small, limited governments to solve economic problems. When Western Europe turned to fascism and Stalin succeeded Lenin in Russia, America's response to the crisis, spearheaded by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the soft socialism of the New Deal. Roosevelt put in place measures that today are thought to have hampered the economy more than helped. FDR increased the government's control of banks, of railroads, of industry, and of farming. He created massive public works projects. He put in place pro-labor union regulations. Under FDR, the top tax rate went as high as 94%. He created America's biggest Ponzi scheme and called it Social Security. During World War II, Roosevelt ordered over 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese and over 10,000 Italian Americans and Italians relocated and interned in camps as potential threats to national security, simply because of their ethnicity and ancestry. Through it all, Roosevelt railed against his critics as predatory capitalists, saying, quote, "The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit." To get his measures approved, Roosevelt attempted to increase the size of the Supreme Court in order to pack it with justices more sympathetic to government expansion. Roosevelt even proposed a second Bill of Rights, which, unlike the first, would not merely guarantee citizens the freedom to pursue happiness, prosperity, and other personal goals, but would actually cause the government to guarantee jobs for all, with a living wage, freedom from unfair competition, a home, medical care, and education. But who would pay for all of this? President Obama's regulatory advisor, Cass Sunstein, wrote a book praising FDR's so-called Second Bill of Rights, and arguing that even though it was never literally passed, the New Deal represents a break with the original Bill of Rights, and a turn toward a more activist government, a change of which he approves. Rights would henceforth be thought of as rights to have things provided for us, rather than rights that simply ensure we will be left alone. Instead of a system of natural rights that are our birthright and an extension of our humanity, we would increasingly be taught to think of goods that must be provided to us by the government, as if we had a right to them. Though many of FDR's measures were repealed after World War II, the new conception of rights that he helped popularize, and the more activist notion of government that went with it, paved the way for an even greater expansion of the state under President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society initiatives. Medicare would be provided for the elderly. Medicaid would supposedly keep the poor healthy. Federal funding for education would begin, eroding local autonomy. A massive war on poverty, we were told, would end many other social problems. And all of this would be conducted simultaneously with a protracted real war in Vietnam. Then, as now, it was sometimes difficult to separate in people's minds cultural trends that celebrated individual liberty and policies often supported by the same self-styled individualists that did more to increase spending and increase bureaucracy than to increase individual freedom. Noble-sounding anti-authoritarian sentiments, sometimes translated into lax or selective policing. The rate of violent crime and property crime doubled in the 1960s, and police were sometimes ineffective at quelling riots and arson in major cities. Yet the government found time to begin a major crackdown on pot smoking that grew into today's disastrous war on drugs. Despite the nostalgic depiction of the 60s as a time of flower children and rock and roll, for many Americans it was a time of fear, with police and protesters clashing in the streets and the future far from certain. By the end of the 60s, the very notion of civil rights had changed from the older idea of ensuring that people and their possessions were secure from attack to the far more complicated idea that government bureaucracies should redistribute wealth, end racial tensions, and equalize the sexes. This greatly expanded, all-pervading notion of a government was reinforced under President Richard Nixon, who campaigned as the law and order solution to the social chaos of the 60s. He may have disdained the leftist counterculture, but he was no small government conservative. He expanded the state through the addition of affirmative action regulations, the creation of environmental protection, small business loans, and the unprecedented and unconstitutional uses of presidential power. He is remembered by many for his connection to the Watergate break-in, but in Washington, as they say, the real crime is what's legal, including, in this case, a presidential declaration freezing prices and wages, perhaps the single greatest blow against the normal functioning of the free market ever delivered solely by an American president. Nixon also took America off the gold standard, which means the government could now inflate the money supply and decrease the purchasing power of a dollar at will in order to pay its own immense debts. Given his casual use and abuse of power, it is not surprising that President Nixon once said, quote, "When the president does it, that means it is not illegal." This wide-ranging regulatory and bureaucratic power, embraced in different ways by Democrats and Republicans, is the big government we largely take for granted today. In the final 2 decades of the 20th century, conservatives claimed that they would fight back and shrink this leviathan, restoring individual liberty. But did they?